Hello, and you are tuned in to Glofcast number 5. I apologize for not getting this out last week. I went on a camping trip, so I am getting it out this week. I was thinking about getting it out a little bit earlier, but I had a pretty busy week, so that just did not happen. Anyway, we're going to do a little bit of a change of pace today. It's going to be an episode that is a little bit more sincere. We're not really going to have much comedy this time around, but it's going to be about something pretty good. It's something that I find actually pretty interesting, and it may set the tone for the podcast in the future. So today what we're going to be talking about is the artist Hobo Johnson as an example of the metamodernist approach within music and metamodernism as a cultural landscape, a cultural movement in and of itself. And so I'm gonna tell you why I chose him specifically as an example of this. But before I do that, I'm gonna talk to you about what differentiates metamodernism from specifically and most relevantly postmodernism, as well as traditionalism and modernism as well. So so this is Glofcast 5. So first things first, what is metamodernism anyway? So if we break it down linguistically, we can see that it's kind of the base modern. I'm not a linguist, so I don't really know this. I know about prefix and suffix. So it has the prefix meta and the suffix ism, and then modern. So it can be roughly translated to modernism of modernism, or the development of being modern of modern. So meta means something of something. And it's only now starting to gain traction within academic philosophical circles, but I think it's a very appropriate term for many aspects within aesthetic and culture, especially ones that came about within the 2010s. It kind of had, I would say, some of its beginnings in the 90s, late 90s, kind of when irony and postmodernism was largely seen at its peak, through TV shows, television programs such as Seinfeld, or maybe even the earlier 2000s, such as It's Always Sunny. But I really think metamodernist media as a whole is really coming into the fold in the 2010s. So the proper term one can agree with on what metamodernism actually is the movement that is potentially happening after postmodernism, or even modernism of modernism. Well, that brings up the question, what the hell is postmodernism, and what the hell is modernism anyway? So, postmodernism, it's kind of a cop-out of an answer, but I define that as the movement that came after modernism. And if that sounds not unhelpful, let's illustrate a timeline. So, bear in mind that the 4 movements I'm going to list are overarching themes and not going to be all-encompassing. So each of the movement has sub-movements, and obviously there are always going to be exceptions to pretty much every rule that I'm going to say today. So everything within the postmodernist movement or postmodernity is not necessarily going to follow all of the postmodernist characteristics. But their existence as movements, it gives a good rule of thumb and is kind of a general compass for the societal attitudes of that time. So it's a good rule of thumb for the art and culture of that day. So for the sake of argument, let's divide the human timeline into 4 main bits. So pre-modernity or traditionalism, modernity, which is modernism, post-modernity, which is postmodernism, and now we'll just say metamodernity and metamodernism. So bear in mind that each of these, while being a movement within philosophy, also leaks into the greater culture as well. So each of these movements can be used to describe culture, media, aesthetics, discourse, and pretty much anything you want, and I mean that seriously. So these are actually pretty all-encompassing in terms of cultural critique in and of themselves. So starting from the beginning, we're going to be talking about traditionalism or pre-modernity, and this was largely within kind of a Eurocentric view of it, an emphasis on the Christian tradition of philosophy, and under that you could include truth and culture as well up to that point. So this was largely seen as pre-Enlightenment, so maybe the scholastics of the day, classical philosophy can kind of be seen under this umbrella as well. The Dark Ages up until, I would say, around the Renaissance, up through or the pre-Enlightenment. So the thing with this you need to bear in mind is exact dates aren't there. There really wasn't a movement or a date in which the entire culture kind of got together and said, okay, we're no longer traditional, but we're going to be modern. But one, I think is kind of a general guideline. We could say around the 16th century or 17th century. So as a cultural movement, as a cultural system, so it viewed extraction of the good, the true, and the beautiful as something to be extracted divinely, so something from God. On a larger scale, it viewed belief in God as the presupposition to all truth, which caused this to manifest itself in the media of the day, which in that day would primarily be books and I guess live music and theater. So I guess common pre-modern themes within books would be man versus nature, man versus man, or man versus God. So there's a bit of a meme going around, so in case you're wondering what that reference was, so there's a bit of a meme going around that kind of shows the literary differences between pre-modern, modern, and postmodern works, and so that's kind of where I got that. I'm going to include a link in the description towards kind of all the things I used with regards to this podcast, so you can kind of check those out for yourself as well. So if we contrast pre-modernity or pre-modernism or traditionalism to modernism, which as a cultural movement, it emphasized the use of several other meta-narratives in general as opposed to one. So in a pre-modern sense, you can really think of the meta-narrative or the narrative of narratives, which were kind of the overarching movements or, I guess, goals or ways of thinking during the day, as just a kind of Christian philosophy, especially within the European side of things. So what modernism did was it just kind of liberated it from that, as opposed to just meta-narratives in general, which you can think of as kind of ways of thinking about the general culture. So an example would be Marxism is good, or capitalism is good, or feminism is good, or science is progress, just kind of all-encompassing ways of thinking about the culture. So, think of a meta-narrative as an ideology or method for explaining the world on a macro-cultural and historical scale. So the main one of the day seemed to emphasize a type of scientism. This was in the modernist post-Enlightenment period, which led scientific progress to be viewed as a type of human progress and ultimately the source of all knowledge. And like I said before, other meta-narratives could be feminism, Marxism, capitalism, etc., so on and so forth. So culturally, modernism was similar to pre-modernism in that it promoted objective truth, but differed in how exactly it got there. So divinely, as opposed to the modernist preferred scientifically. So modernist themes were generally highly sincere and generally promoted some degree of optimism about the future, because during that time there was a lot of scientific progress, and the belief of the day was that scientific progress equated to human progress. So common modernist themes within media included man versus society, man versus self, and man versus the fact that there may not be a God. So those are just some modernist themes to be on the lookout for. And so after modernism, we arrive at postmodernism, which this podcast, along with, of course, Metamodernism and Hobo Johnson, is going to be about, since postmodernism is going to be the most relevant one, and of course Metamodernism, for our purposes. So if you think of modernism as the construction and promotion of the meta-narratives that I described earlier, or narratives, postmodernism is the rejection and subsequently the deconstruction of those meta-narratives. So what exactly happened to get them to that point? And I kind of have my own hypothesis about it. It's obviously highly up for debate, but kind of the start of postmodernism was viewed at 1945. So what happened in 1945 that kind of challenged the preconception of meta-narratives or narratives as narratives of that day? So, obviously that was the end of World War II, and highly relevant, the detonation of two humongous atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So If it was my guess, I would wager a guess that it was the point where the meta-narrative of scientific progress as human progress, one of the defining features of modernism, was at the very least called into question, because up until that point, you literally had two gigantic atomic bombs detonating over two Japanese cities, eviscerating well over 100,000 people. So that's scientific progress, but you couldn't really equate that to being actual human progress. So if the meta-narrative, if one of the largest meta-narratives of modernism, which is scientific progress as human progress, was called into question, then that kind of brings other meta-narratives into question as well. Or maybe the idea of the meta-narrative should be called into question. So with all of this said, what features are notable in postmodern works? So from a conflict paradigm that I kind of described earlier, you can see postmodernism literary and media works as man versus technology, man versus reality, and man versus author. So it kind of breaks the fourth wall a little bit there. And so far, based on kind of what we saw there, postmodern, in my opinion, actually sounds kind of cool. It's deconstructing everything and kind of just seeing where all the flaws lie. So modernism, you can kind of view it as being almost seen as a failure on its own terms. So science as progress, as the prevailing meta-narrative, obviously didn't kind of work out that way. So you can view postmodernism as correcting it through the deconstruction of pretty much everything you can imagine, such as the idea of meta-narrative, postmodernism deconstructing itself, deconstruction of deconstruction. And how did it deconstruct? Through the use of critique and primarily irony on a very surface level, as opposed to the very sincere depth of study associated with modernism. So through the deconstruction of everything, including reason itself, science itself, language and truth itself, many postmodern pieces of art and media didn't really stand for anything at all except for their own deconstruction and the deconstruction of whatever they were satirizing. And so you view it as skepticism and deconstruction for really no other sake than their own sake. And when everything is deconstructed and criticized to hell and back, there doesn't really exist much to be sincerely enjoyed, expressed, or used without thinking there exists something better, or if the thing in question was really worth paying attention to at all. And so that is... It's not my explanation there. It wasn't all encompassing by any stretch of the imagination, but that was kind of a surface level, or i.e. postmodernist interpretation of it. So there are nuances and details I may have skipped for the sake of time, but this topic has been covered to hell and back by people smarter than me, and so this is part of the podcast where the metamodernist movement will come into play. So as previously stated, the largest problem that exists with postmodernism from kind of a cultural and media and entertainment perspective is that postmodernism, as it was outlined by David Foster Wallace, in that irony and deconstruction permeated the cultural landscape to such an extent that it created a sort of nothingness. So where only irony and deconstruction exist, nothing actually stands, because everything is just deconstructed to death with no viable alternatives are actually proposed. So given this conflict, given this problem that postmodernism has kind of presented, this is where the metamodernist movement and metamodernism comes in to kind of save the day a little bit. So if postmodernism's cultural peak was in the 1990s, with the 2000s being a shift between postmodernism and metamodernism as movements, the 2010s illustrate metamodernism really coming into the fold as a cultural movement. So this begs the question, what the hell is metamodernism anyway? The best and most concise explanation I have found about metamodernism is the Metamodernist Manifesto, which is found on metamodernism.org, which I'll include a link to in the description. And there's a pretty good blog about the topic as a cultural movement at themetamodernist.com. So metamodernism as a term was proposed actually back in the 1970s, 1975, but only started gaining traction as a cultural movement fairly recently. So if you want to look at kind of the skeletons, bare bones of all of this, you need to look at David Foster Wallace's kind of new sincerity movement when he kind of... I don't know where exactly it was he outlined it, but he called for a new sincerity as an alternative to the irony that was kind of reigning during the day. So the new sincerity of David Foster Wallace is kind of the bare bones framework of what metamodernism is today. So if you want to know what exactly the metamodernists metamodernism stands for with regards to postmodernism, I recommend reading the manifesto of the metamodernists. So the main theme that they recognize is oscillation. So oscillation between sincerity and irony, objectivity and subjectivity in terms of truth, existence and deconstruction, science and art, as well as the obligation of the artist to always pursue truth. So that kind of keeps a unwavering sincerity beneath the metamodernist works, as opposed to just kind of making fun of everything for its own sake. So the metamodernist needs to stand for something. So if you compare this to the total deconstruction of everything for no other sake than the deconstruction's sake, metamodernism, it offers a little bit of a more earnest outlook from that regard. So now I know all this sounds nice, but what does all of this really even mean? And so how does Hobo Johnson as an artist even fit into all of this? So I chose Hobo Johnson as an example of metamodernism because in my mind he's contemporary enough to fully be considered a metamodern artist. With the characteristics within his music they're easily discernible enough to demonstrate what is meant by metamodern. So he is by no means the first or greatest metamodern artist, and probably not the one that comes to mind for a lot of people, such as maybe Sufjan Stevens or Ariel Pink, Neutral Milk Hotel, or Sturgill Simpson. But in my opinion, his music illustrates the points pretty easily. So, yeah. First of all, we're going to be taking a look at Hobo Johnson's most popular track, and the one that I like the most, frankly. It's called Peach Scones. So, specifically, we're going to be looking at the NPR Desk Concert version. So, regardless of what you think of the kid or his music, I know he's kind of had a little bit of controversy recently. The earnestness within the song is something to be acknowledged as kind of a state of music and cultural commentary and art really at this current point in time. So one of the most notable points within the song is when he screams, "I love the thought of being with you," or maybe it's the thought of not being so alone. And so you can view this as a textbook example of metamodern oscillation. So here we have a quirky, kind of goofy looking guy showing his true feelings, or maybe an exaggeration of those feelings in order to get the truer, maybe the more nuanced, truer feelings across. And he's speaking to it in a slightly ironic exaggeration, exaggerated for the effect of making the sincerity maybe a little bit easier to swallow, regardless of the response he may get from the coolly detached hip onlookers. So the result is a quirkiness, but the use of the irony within the song to communicate sincere emotions, which to me is the defining motif of metamodern art. And so you see this oscillation between sincerity and irony used to convey a sincere emotion and kind of a sincere truth behind the song. So a lot of people, Hobo Johnson has gotten a bit of flack for this for a few reasons. So there's been some chastisement that Hobo Johnson is complaining about the friend zone, or that awkward yelling about one's emotions is the main and best way to be sincere, despite oftentimes being more forefront than other methods, or that if one once actually communicated to a girl in the way that Hobo did, she would be running for her fucking life. To which I say, being in the friend zone, it sucks, but it's just a song. He's speaking about the conflict he has with his current state of existence, or maybe even existence in general. And that's in terms of the man versus existence paradigm, which I'll be touching on here pretty soon. This isn't the only part or only song where Hobo kind of does this. He may not scream on other songs, but he definitely kind of communicates a struggle with existence. So most notably on Romeo and Juliet, or Dear Labels, or Father, or kind of the Rise of Hobo Johnson album. So there's a cynical sincerity portrayed in the struggle against existence, and it's a textbook metamodern theme. And there's an underlying optimism behind all of this that despite kind of all the shit that he's going through, all the emotions and struggle against existence that he may be struggling against, he's still going to kind of keep on going, and that he really doesn't have much of a choice with that regard. And he doesn't use the song as a deconstruction of itself, which is a commitment to what he's doing, and something that I think personally a lot of artists, including myself, could really learn a little bit more about. So I'm trying to incorporate that into my podcast a little bit, because when a piece of art or media self-deconstructs or beats the critics to the punch, it's a defensive mechanism and one rampant in postmodern media. So it's especially ironic given that it often gives the impression that the creator created the art or media with an ulterior motive in mind, such as not doing something for the sake of doing something. So to me, this is fundamentally dishonest and a bit weak, because how or why would one deconstruct something when the thing does it to itself? And so obviously you're going to critique yourself. I guess you can think about it maybe the worst or the easiest, depending on how you look at it. But it leaves the audience in kind of an ironically awkward position, which is, it's a hint ironic, given that the awkwardness is usually associated with sincerity, kind of especially within metamodernism and the quirkiness aspect. So when a piece of media self-deconstructs, it doesn't really leave the audience much anything else to do. It's just, they're just kind of sitting there like, okay, I can't really enjoy this because you're kind of pointing out all the flaws, and I can't really point out all the flaws because you're pointing out all the flaws. And so it's, metamodernism kind of flips this around a little bit by using the irony for sincerity's sake instead of for its own sake. So within the conflict paradigm I outlined earlier, how does metamodernism fit within the trope of conflict present within media? So when postmodernism had man versus reality, technology, and breaking the fourth wall by conflicting with the author, where does one even really go from there? I've seen a few things on, I've read about this a little bit on various blogs and stuff like that, and a few people have called in the idea, the paradigm of conflict in and of itself into question with metamodernism, saying it should really be man as man, or man as society, or man as God. So calling in the idea of conflict in and of itself. But I don't think we've done away with conflict quite yet. So Reddit user Super Stingray had a pretty interesting take on it. He didn't scrap away the idea of conflict within metamodernism entirely, but he definitely had kind of an interesting take with regards to kind of our current situation. So before I lay out these themes that he kind of came up with, bear in mind the overarching conflict paradigm prevalent in metamodern, media. It could be summed up mainly as man versus existence. So metamodernism addresses the struggle of existence in a superior way than something like postmodernism did, because it recognizes that earnestness and irony for an earnest end is ultimately the best way to deal with the struggle that is existence. Other metamodernist themes that deal with the conflict and struggling of existence, other metamodernist pieces of media, could include maybe BoJack Horseman, Rick and Morty, Parks and Rec, and Community, because all of those shows deal with maybe a sincere earnestness to connect, or sincere earnestness in terms of dealing with existence. And so Hobo's struggle with existence will be explained further, but there are three subcategories underneath the man versus existence paradigm prevalent under metamodernism. So under the man versus existence overarching umbrella, you can view the first conflict paradigm under metamodernism as being man versus need. And so this encapsulates man's struggles with dependency on anything either by attempting to fulfill said need or pretending the need doesn't actually exist. So, the perfect example of this with regards to Hobo Johnson would be in Peach Scones, his most popular song. So, in this song, he is struggling with the fact that he likes the thought of being with this girl, or more broadly, just the thought of not being so alone. So, he's currently reconciling his need to not be so alone with his current situation, such as giving an honest effort to be with this girl that he likes, but he plans on, regardless of whether he explicitly says it or not, he's just going to kind of keep on keeping on regardless of whatever the outcome may be. So if it goes as planned, great. If it doesn't, what else is he really going to do? I mean, he's just kind of going to go with it. What else can he do? So he's struggling with dependency on romantic interaction. And from a more platonic and parental standpoint, this term can also be seen on tracks such as Father and Romeo and Juliet, where Hobo struggles with his need for platonic relationships with his parents who underwent a divorce. The second one is Man versus Fate, and it encapsulates the struggle with understanding one's own potential as well as coming to terms with the often unchangeable fate that the protagonist knows is coming. So this is pretty prevalent on his song Romeo and Juliet, where he's trying to come to terms with his parents' divorce, specifically as a young child, as well as the entire experience of just falling out of love, as well as the 50% divorce rate statistic. In a similar way, kind of with coming to terms with one's own potential, you can view this manifested on his track Dear Labels, where he is coming to terms with struggling to expand outside of the traditional genre realm for the sake of finding his own voice as an artist. The third category is Man versus Answers, and this is kind of a testament to what is known as post-truth in an eternally connected information saturation society. So while this might not be prevalent to or relevant to Hobo Johnson at first, to clarify, post-truth is a largely political term where confirmation bias it's essentially more readily available than it's ever been, and it's more prevalent due to the interconnectedness of our current world, and so pretty much we can't take in all of this information. We just simply can't. So what do? We resort to this appeal to emotions to take precedence over pretty much any other appeal, at least with regards to politics. So you may be wondering, how does this relate exactly to Hobo Johnson? To answer that, we must view post-truth and the everlasting confirmation bias present on the internet as a contemporary subset of something far older, yet something highly relevant with regards to metamodernism, the concept of paradox. Now, with regards to paradox in Hobo Johnson, you have the juxtaposition of this quirky yet lovable and somewhat goofy-looking person, Hobo Johnson, speaking about highly sincere, highly personal, and at times dark and even somewhat religious themes, such as on his song Jesus Christ, within his music. So anyway, I hope those conflict paradigms relate Hobo Johnson and metamodernism well. I'll include some links in the description to some additional articles about characteristics of postmodernism and kind of how I use those, as well as some particular articles how they might define multiple characteristics of metamodernism. So, as stated previously, oscillation, post-irony, and quirkiness are definite tenets of metamodernism. A lot of times, I guess you could view paradox or kind of minimalism or maximalism as kind of tenets of it as well. A cautious return to meta-narratives. And as you can kind of see, these are all pretty prevalent within Hobo's music and persona. And so, anyways, I want to know, what is your opinion on metamodernism? So, what other artists embody the tenets of metamodernism well? Do you think the progression to metamodernism is a fair characterization, or do you think another cultural movement should be used instead, such as remodernism, postmodernism, or performatism? So, with regards to metamodernism in general, I'm struggling to see how the traditional modern and postmodern frameworks that the metamodernist characterization of truth would fit into that. So with traditionalism, with regards to truth, it was kind of divine. Modernism, it was more scientific. Postmodernism, it was deconstructed entirely to kind of, there was no objective truth. Metamodernism, I think it's more of a return to modernism in that meta-narratives are kind of seen as something a little bit worthwhile, but not gospel. So it, from what I can tell, it's the acknowledgement of objective reality, but there's still some debate on how exactly it is we're going to be getting there. So, from a few sources, I've seen it as a cautious return to objectivity in meta-narratives, or simply reconstruction. So, philosophically, I'm just wondering if this even makes sense. So, anyways, this was Glofcast 5. I may have asked more questions than I answered here, but I hope you enjoyed this. This was Hobo Johnson and Metamodernism, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, and see you next week.